Somehow Palpatine returned.
Welcome back to another episode of Hey Tim, are you okay? I'm just looking at those bags under your eyes. Today's video is brought to you by the only word to describe exactly what it is: brilliant. I am big into accessible education, that is what I do in these videos, and Brilliant is all about teaching people how to code and program and how to manage and understand data, which is super important if you want to be self-employed. So use my link down in the description below. Resurrection. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's...
Somehow Palpatine returned.
But before we continue, tell me down in the comments and mark your comment with spoilers. What do you think is the worst or the best resurrection you've ever seen? Let me know down below. In Del Toro's recent Pinocchio film, Pinocchio's creation is depicted like a murder scene. Geppetto, drunk on the misery of the loss of his son Carlo, hacks down a pine tree and begins to carve the puppet from its trunk. We get flashes of a shadowy hand and knife against the wall like you might see in an old Hitchcock film. The imagery focuses on the cutting, the slashing, the hacking. This is not a scene of loving artistry bringing a boy back to life. It is a drunkard tearing a soul from the grave. Geppetto even cries out, "I will have him back. I will make Carlo again." When Pinocchio is brought to life, it is done so with electricity, bringing Frankenstein's creature to mind, a being formed from the pieces of corpses. Both of these are resurrections in a sense, bringing the dead back to life, but they're both based in grim ambitions, ego, and torturous grief. Resurrection stories are so often not about the one being resurrected, but the one bringing them back, and the consequences of that. You can explore grief and misery and pain, like with Geppetto. How we deal with these things, the inability to let go, the lengths that our obsessions will take us to, that fundamental drive of humanity to defy death itself, to cling to life, to fight that uphill battle we know we will lose. This is why Geppetto's arc in Pinocchio is about accepting that Pinocchio is not the son he wanted to bring back, but someone new, that we cannot resurrect the dead, but we can find new love, new life. While Pinocchio, desperate for his father's love, tries to emulate the dead boy he was meant to be this resurrection of, to the point of becoming an Italian fascist soldier his father could be proud of, obedient and accomplished. His father's grief causes him to abandon his sense of self. Do we accept death or lose ourselves in our obsession with resurrecting someone else, or worse, make the very person we're trying to bring back lose themselves in that process? Lindsay Manousos does something really interesting with this trope in her story, An Old Man Cometh and He Is Overgrown, where a man stricken with grief of his bygone wife tries to drag her soul back into the world of the living. The figure sitting at the table in Tilly's seat was but a shade, a soul that Udo had amassed from his magic, his memories and trinkets Tilly loved. It was a scarecrow of bows, cloth, wildflower sticks and leaves. Her shoulders were 2 milk bottles. I should have noticed there was some missing. Her face was an amalgamation of buttons, thimbles, thread from her kit, and dead leaves. He saved her voice, his memories of her, and molded something anew. Her soul is trapped inside this artificial body, but the way she moves, she speaks, acts now is more a projection of his memory of her than the person she truly is. Is this not a kind of violence? Dragging someone's soul back and forcing it into another body? Forcing it into the idea you had of them? Our grief can cause us to do terrible things, and you can reflect that in how the person is actually resurrected, the methods they have to turn to. Manousos describes Tilly as a shade, a scarecrow, things we cast or prop up, something not quite her. And these stories often end up in the person ultimately letting that soul go on, or their demise and their inability to let go. There's a part of a morality tale to that. It makes sense here that Pinocchio is a puppet, someone brought to life by strings pulled by others, a thing cast, a thing propped up, and it's only in others allowing him to be himself that he can become a real boy, the strings cut, no longer just the projections of others. These stories are more about the inner conflicts of other characters than trying to undo the effects of external conflicts that got them killed. And that's okay, because that's a different point of tension. If you want to play with this idea, maybe the resurrected person might inherit some of the resurrected's personality, or conform to the ideals someone else has of them. How we feel about the resurrection is often defined by the actions others take to bring them back in the first place, and the life that person is then forced to live. But alternatively, resurrection can be a beautiful expression of love and life in defiance of evil, and that all comes from how it's framed. Geppetto's kind of resurrection is framed like a murder scene because it's an ugly representation of the inability to let go. Tilly's resurrection is this uncomfortable patchwork of a person as a reflection of desperation, but Flynn Rider's resurrection in Tangled is a testament to the power of Rapunzel's love to conquer death itself, the ultimate enemy. It's an optimistic message. It's love being the realest magic there is thematically. Pinocchio is resurrected one final time at the end of the film, but it tries to thematically justify itself in a way, because unlike the resurrection at the start, this is framed as an expression of love and acceptance of Pinocchio for who he is, not obsessive grief. We don't tend to mind resurrections when we can believe and care about what they represent thematically, and that is a fine line to tread. It's much more about the feel of the story world that you're selling someone on. This does not mean it can come out of nowhere, but if it feels like something earned by the heart of the story, then we tend to be more accepting. But it's not just that. Resurrection might be one of the oldest tropes in the game, which makes sense because death is the oldest antagonist in the game. Our oldest mythologies are rife with gods and heroes being resurrected, fighting death, returning from hell, finding ways to escape hell. We keep telling these stories to explore this tense relationship we've always had with death and the place death has in the human condition. And how you play with resurrection is gonna say something about that. It is one of the few things we all share as a species, and it's why when these stories deal with death and mortality and fate, they often have the people who are resurrected come back less human. It's one of my favorite tropes, and the most famous example you've probably seen is in A Song of Ice and Fire. Beric Dondarrion is resurrected over and over and over by the Red God, and each time he is brought back, he is less himself. Can I dwell on what I scarce remember? I held a castle on the marches once, and there was a woman I was pledged to marry, but I could not find that castle today, nor tell you the colour of the woman's hair. Who knighted me, oh friend? What were my favourite foods? It all fades. In this story, his resurrection is a costly defiance of natural law, of his own mortality, and it takes something from him each time, his memories, his loves, his favourite foods. But this begs the question, what is it that death gives us? What is the core part of who we are? What makes us human? Is it our memories, our morality, our capacity to feel, to remember? Is it that we are the universe perceiving itself and we start to lose that in death? Do we look at a child starving on the street and feel nothing? What are we without these things, without a recollection of ourself? And in that, is the cost of resurrection worth it? Sometimes what the resurrected person leaves behind is more important than what they bring back, as a point of conflict or tension in your story. If a lover brings back their husband, but the husband loses their love for them in the process, what happens to that relationship? In this way, resurrection lets you narrow in on what makes us alive as well, what it means to live and be human. If you want it to be heartbreaking, what could you take from someone that would truly hurt them or the characters around them, the people trying to bring them back? What might you say about being human?
For too long I've been parched of thirst and unable to quench it. Too long I've been starving to death and haven't died. I feel nothing. Not the wind on my face, nor the spray of the sea, nor the warmth of a woman's flesh.
At some point, death must be preferable, or the person you bring back is just not them. The extreme versions of this lead us into horror, into undead monsters, creatures without consciousness, people reduced to animals and base instincts. In sci-fi, people are often brought back as robots or AI, their minds uploaded to computers, or brought back with technology rather than magic. We see this in Children of Time, The Roadside Picnic, Mortal Engines, and these stories are just as much about what resurrection does as it is about separating humanity from the flesh, what propping ourselves up with technology does. In many of these stories, characters become less emotional, thinking more like a machine, more calculating, losing their ability to empathize with others, analyze things the way a human might. These stories narrow in on the ethics of unchecked technology and science, what it means to be artificial and real, and what we lose in escaping our mortality, because in a sense, resurrection is a kind of artificial life, right? You could certainly view it that way. And much like we understand the thematic place resurrection has in your story by the methods a person ends up using, what they sacrifice, maybe it's blood magic, or they lose themselves to obsession and abandon all of their friends. We also look at the life that person lives. If they're trapped in a mannequin that cannot feel, or a brain in a jar, or you'll force them to desire and crave human blood for the rest of their lives. There's sort of a metaphorical version of all of this in Richard Morgan's Altered Carbon, where the uber-wealthy people of the future can upload their minds into new clone bodies when they die. The actual resurrection doesn't do anything to their personality or memories like Beric Dondarrion. There's not this existential, inherent moral value to our ability to die that makes us human. No, here, it's the inability to die as a result of their wealth that makes them inhuman. See, the Methuselahs are these cold, uncaring, distant, unempathetic people who try to convince themselves they're sometimes good people. Thematically, here it's that our ability to die keeps us grounded and connected to the others who can die. Losing that shared experience changes us. Someone who cannot die might be less concerned about what others will do to them or ethical restraints in how they live their life. To them, life can be bought, and if you can't afford more life, maybe you're just not working hard enough. It changes how we relate to others who are not only monetarily, but physically beneath us in a way. It allows our flaws and sins to go unchecked, to be magnified. It's more about the material inequality of life and death that makes someone inhuman. Alternatively, some characters who are immortal or continually resurrected might feel that their life is cheap or worthless. They can put themselves into dangerous situations, or other people might force them into dangerous situations. That's what happens in Pinocchio. There's a fascist soldier who says, "Hey, Pinocchio, you're gonna come back over and over and over. That means you're the perfect soldier. You can die over and over and over for the fatherland. For the motherland. For El Duce." And with all this talk about the value of death and being human, you've got to ask, is any of that true? Because listen to this passage from Sam Gay's Monsters Never Leave You. Magic isn't absolute power or non-consensual exchange. It's not a taking. There's no perversion of the natural order. But the boy interrupts, "I'm dead." "Somewhat," she admits. "But your sister called your bones, and your bones agreed to rise. Your sister needed you, so you came back. What could be more natural than that?" Is death really essential to the human condition, or have we just accepted it? Is defying it so wrong, or have we just convinced ourselves it has to be because we can't fight it? After all, we prevent death all the time. We've eliminated diseases which have killed millions. We extend our lives in so many ways. Is this maybe just another? In stories like this, resurrection can be part of the natural order, another way for life to renew itself. After all, we talk about, us dying and coming back as flowers. What if we just came back as ourselves? In Ian M. Banks' Culture series, death is a choice in a world of infinite resources, something they erase like cancer or smallpox. People still die, they just do it on their own terms. And yeah, it does fundamentally change us, but it doesn't make us wrong or evil. It just makes us something new, something different. And humanity has always been becoming a different thing. It all depends on what you want to say with your story, the methods people use, the life the resurrected person lives, and how you present the conflicts and tension around it. Fundamentally, we don't tend to mind resurrection so much as a narrative beat if there is a big ding cost in one of three ways: either a cost to the person brought back, like with Beric Dondarrion, a cost paid by the person bringing them back, like how in The Amber Spyglass, His Dark Materials, Lyra takes basically a whole book to break her friend out of hell, and it's famously easier to get into hell than it is to get out of it. Or 3, a cost in the narrative to follow that we haven't seen yet. The chaos and problems it creates in its wake. If it is cheap to resurrect someone on the way there, maybe let it create more problems than it solves after the fact. Let it spring into more narratives, complicate the story in ways they hadn't perceived. I mean, that is the Jurassic Park question, right? With good resurrections, there is usually someone paying the cost. It's just a matter of who and when. And if it's cheap for your characters, it feels cheap for the reader. And you can play with this structurally to keep your readers interested. We only start to understand the cost as the story progresses, and in this way you can turn it into a mystery, you can turn it into a plot hook, into something that strings us from scene to scene as you drop hints and clues. Philip K. Dick does this a lot in his stories, like in Under the Dull Earth, where a girl called Sylvia is pretty easily resurrected, but we start to realize, oh, something's off, something's weird, something's wrong, and everyone else on the planet is starting to turn into that girl physically. dramatically, she is brought back as a virus infecting everyone. So it's not just about how you justify the resurrection in your story, but how you reveal that justification to the reader. And the way someone is brought back can be dramatically interesting as a point of inner conflict or external conflict. I asked about it on my socials, and a lot of people brought up Quaritch in Avatar 2. He's brought back in the body of his enemy, one of the Na'vi. Or imagine a pacifist brought back as a vampire, or brought back but you're now subject through magic to someone who you had a conflict with in life. Consider not just what your resurrection means thematically, but what relationship your character would have with the way that they have been brought back. Imagine an artist brought back, but they lose their love and skill for art in doing so. Who are they now? Sometimes the ends does not justify the means, or the means complicate how we feel about the end. And Resurrection's a perfect place to do that. There are a huge number of resurrections in stories where someone gets brought back on like a condition, you know? They have to do a God's bidding, or dedicate their life to something, or they're forced to live as a government asset, you know? And naturally that leads to conflict, life at the cost of autonomy. Resurrection can be a punishment or an obstacle if you're trapped in something like a time loop. And of course, it's hard to talk about resurrection without addressing the Messiah in the room, Jesus H. Christ. Resurrection has deeply religious roots, not just in Christianity, but there are many religions with stories of gods returning from the dead with new powers, new purpose. Odin hangs himself to death on a tree to gain knowledge of the many other worlds. Because sometimes death is the price you pay to come back more, to come back better, a more fully realized version of yourself, the crucible of death, of sacrifice, of willing and voluntary suffering becoming the cost you paid to gain something existentially valuable. This is kind of why the immortal Methuselahs of altered carbon don't improve in their resurrection thematically, because resurrection is cheap for them. There is no willing and voluntary suffering to gain something greater, not of any real worth beyond money. They're avoiding divine punishment and building these homes in the clouds of themselves, far above everyone else. These are artificial heavens, faking their own divinity. Resurrection can be used to separate some characters from others in your world building, and some characters come back less human, but others return more divine. And these resurrection stories really depend on depicting that resurrection as a payment for the sacrifice or suffering or death that they originally paid. And you've got to think about that very consciously, how their new strengths or weaknesses might reflect the story or sacrifice they originally made in the story. In these stories, death can be a purifying force, something which purges you of things which previously held you back and allow you to become your true self. This is, in a way, the biblical story. There's this line in Corinthians which reads, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then I shall know even as I am known." But at the end of time, when everyone is supposedly resurrected, they will see clearly, more like God. Which parts of your characters would you want to elevate in their resurrection, or let them leave behind? What powers or insight or knowledge or revelation could you give them in their resurrection to make that original sacrifice meaningful? They can be second chances. Again, it all depends on what you want to say with your story. Someone can come back greater and stronger and wiser, but also be less human. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, erasing flaws is arguably something which makes you less human as well. One of my favorite subtropes of this is the character who keeps trying to sacrifice themselves, and every time the gods are like, "I'm not done with you, get your ass back in there." But these stories are tricky to handle. It's really important to have this strong sense of cause and consequence, that a character does something, and this is not undoing what they did, but the natural consequence of it. Like Odin hanging himself on the tree to gain knowledge and coming back with greater knowledge, like that's very clear. A character sacrificing their life to protect a city, and then the gods being like, "Hey, you know what, you did such a good job of that, we're actually going to make you the immortal protector of this city for all time." There's a symmetry there, right? In the 3 resurrections of Jessica Churchill, a girl is brought back to life repeatedly by an alien microbe which has come to inhabit her body. It lives in her gut and keeps her alive when other people are making her life miserable. It cares about her in its own way, but it's a morally complex story about whether we should have the choice to end our lives when mentally we are not that well. And at the end of the story, after being brought back without consultation, she resolves, if they could make her hallucinate, what else were they doing to her? You haven't left me any choices. And she resolves to end her life. Resurrection here is an ethical question about whether we should get to make that choice and, more importantly, whether we can make it rationally and what it means to do that. Are you harming someone by taking away their choice to die, by forcing them to live? In the case of time loop stories, resurrections can be punishments and crucibles. They can force people to live in a different way, to take a different path. But of course, when it comes to resurrections, the main thing people worry about is
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Yeah, it's dumb. Does it cheapen the stakes? Does it ruin the death? And a lot of the time, yeah. I mean, I wrote the stupid Lord of the Rings Star Wars crossover story when I was like 8 about Palpatine surviving. He fell down the shaft and the stormtrooper caught him in a ship, just like 300 meters down. And it says something that the justification for him coming back that way is better than what they gave us in Rise of Skywalker.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
The somehow is just as offensive as Palpatine returned. First rule of a power system, right? Solving problems with magical technology is proportional to how well we understand that magical technology, and this one was right out of the arse, alright? Foreshadowing is important, so it doesn't feel like this sort of thing came out of nowhere, and they didn't really establish this. But more than that, when you kill a character, you're meant to feel something, even if it's just satisfaction, and if you start bringing characters back from the dead, then it risks people not thinking the threat of death is real, or more importantly, they don't feel satisfied when it happens, because it doesn't quite feel as real as it did before. Why should I care when anyone can get a clone? So what do? Well, we've already covered a bunch of stories where the resurrection causes as many problems, if not more, than it solves, just as much about the cost as it is the benefit. It becomes a problem, not a solution, or at least a very bad solution. But if you want to use resurrection in your story, especially if you want to use it a lot, then you've just got to be very conscious about where you are drawing tension from in your story. Because you don't have to make us worry about whether characters are going to die, even in action scenes. Like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood has these villains who keep getting resurrected over and over hundreds of times, so tension in fights with them isn't usually about whether they'll die, but whether the protagonist can escape, or they can get the MacGuffin, or save someone who knows something important. They don't pretend that they've killed them every time and bring them back over and over as a surprise. But this also means that later on, when we realize that we actually can kill these guys in a special way, that shift in tension to will they finally die is amazing. Because killing someone who we have seen resurrected 1,000 times, who we know has never even been a possibility before, carries so much more meaning now. It's tense because we know how unlikely this is to work. They use resurrection to up the tension because it takes options away from your heroes. Okay, and before people actually me in the comments, these villains are possibly more super healing than resurrection, but I mean, they get blown to smithereens over and reformed, so it's close enough. You don't need to pretend your heroes are dead or dying. Make us worried about some other objective. Or if they do die, either treat it as a non-issue or draw our attention to other more interesting things that actually will pay off in the long run. Like in the 3 resurrections of Jessica Churchill, the tension comes from this ethical quandary, this conflict between this alien symbiote and Jessica herself. Not whether she survives any of her ordeals, that's never really a question, we're never worried about that. In the 15 Lives of Harry August, a guy lives the same life over and over. Death is not a tense question here. The story is about how he's meant to live that repeated life. The cheapness only tends to happen when 1, we've been sold on the idea that they can die, 2, there's not a great justification for them coming back, and 3, the story really depended on their tension of whether or not they'll get out alive. This is especially relevant for shows like Doctor Who, where you know the Daleks or the Doctor aren't really dead, no matter how many times they're killed. So the good stories draw tension from whether secondary characters will die, who we know can, or ethical conundrums, or the loss of our characters' morals, or their stability, or other things, which they can actually lose. Killing or harming other characters permanently is even more important in stories like this for keeping the stakes up, especially more important than how any resurrection might work. In a lot of these stories, the tension question isn't so much, are the Daleks or the Doctor going to die, but can they be killed quick enough, or can they live long enough before something else bad happens? But I think a lot of people know that resurrections can cheapen the stakes, and I want to talk about a more fundamental problem with the resurrections, or with Palpatine's resurrection specifically. On a meta-narrative level, Palpatine's resurrection was meaningless. Death is a really important plot beat in the story. It carries a purpose. It will often conclude a character's arc, tie up threads of tension, or motivate other important changes in the narrative or other characters. Like, Ned Stark's death sparks the entirety of the rest of the story. It changes every character around him, enemies and allies alike. It symbolically represents the death of honor, that any character can die, no one is safe, signifying what kind of story this is to the reader. Even though resurrection does exist in Westeros, we talked about it with Beric Dondarrion, even with a high cost, even with a massive effort, multi-books long, to bring him back, bringing Ned back would still be a bad idea when put alongside what his death is meant to mean in the story, right? Like, it is really important that Ned is dead. Likewise, Palpatine's story was done. His death is the conclusion of Vader's story. It brings Luke to his darkest point. It symbolizes the end of the Empire and authoritarianism. It was Clearly never planned here in Rise of Skywalker. No matter how well set up or foreshadowed this was, no matter how well justified it was in the lore, it's still a very weird choice, because his initial death is so wrapped up in making all of those other things meaningful, making them matter, especially when Luke and Han and Leia are already dead by the time he appears in the story again. They aren't able to react to it, to recontextualize these things. Imagine your story as a painting. Death is part of that image. All of the colors you've put in there are working together. And resurrection is like trying to paint over that into something else that wasn't meant to be there originally, or use that part of the image in a new painting. It doesn't always work, especially if it wasn't part of the original plan. Fundamentally, with Palpatine, because it doesn't mean anything and it weakens the stuff his original death represented. Well, let's be honest, it meant fan service. And if you bring a character back whose original death didn't really mean much, then readers are just left asking, well, why kill them in the first place? So you've got to think about your resurrection on that meta-narrative level, not just how to make it feel narratively earned, but what it does to the original death and what it does for the story now. Where resurrections are okay, it's usually because it doesn't impact the original meaning the death had in the narrative, or even elevates it, like those kind of religious resurrections we talked about before, where there's a clear commentary on their original death and suffering and how they come back, or their return says something really interesting in your painting, in your tapestry. Palpatine's place could have basically been taken by anyone. He means nothing to Rey or Kylo. He doesn't do much to elevate either of their arcs, and arguably his position should have been taken by Kylo Ren. You know, in the finale of Stargate Atlantis, Ronan gets resurrected not minutes after being killed in the final battle. It feels cheap, not only because it's just a momentary shock they tried to play as a permanent death, but because his death was a sacrifice that made winning feel more satisfying for me. Without it, winning cost all of our characters basically nothing. And everyone hates fake out deaths, right? There, the resurrection was cheap, but also the victory in the story that kind of depended on was cheap. So, you want to play with the resurrection. Ask yourself one question. Does bringing them back hold a more interesting place in your narrative tapestry than leaving them dead does? Because sometimes that is the case. Sometimes it is more interesting, even more important than whatever cost people pay to make it happen, though that's often intertwined. And I know this is a really subjective question, but it's fundamentally why we like Beric Dondarrion's resurrection, for that thematic and world-building implication, or the 3 resurrections of Jessica Churchill for that ethical quandary, or I've heard that Buffy the Vampire Slayer does this really well. I haven't seen it, but apparently it introduces a really interesting conflict in the wake of the resurrection, which is way better than what came before. Or in John Langan's The Fisherman, which really plays up the resurrection for horror. Or Captain Jack Harkness for the stories that it leads into. Their deaths do matter, but only in the shadow of their resurrections. Their resurrections ask more narratively interesting questions than what their deaths initially represented, and it's that makes us want to keep reading and watching. You know, it's not about me wanting these characters back, but wanting to see what happens when they are. Because at least in old TV shows, characters often were just brought back because people wanted them. See Supernatural. But built into this is another thing I just want to touch on. You don't have to kill a character. That's not even the worst thing you can do with them. Sometimes forcing them to live with the consequences of their own actions is far more interesting. Punish them in other ways. Take their memories, their place in society, their understanding of themselves. Are you killing them for shock value or just to make a story beat feel costly, knowing you're going to bring them back? Or are you killing and resurrecting them because that transition will complicate the story in interesting, intentional ways? What are you accidentally saying about your themes and how you deal with a resurrection? Because there are other ways to get shock value. This is why the best resurrection stories are so much often not about the resurrection itself, but the things happening around it. And of course, an inevitable part of every resurrection is that scene where someone asks, hey, did you see what comes after death? You know, what's life like? And a lot of writers are going to wave it off as, oh, I don't remember anything, because they don't want to deal with the existential ramifications of confirmation of like another world after death. But in a world of gods and magic, you can sometimes play with whatever happens in between. Hints at the mythology as your world building, or alternatively, knowledge from beyond the grave can change how they view living. You know, the realization that there is nothing can inspire a kind of existential horror. The realization there is something can change you. All of this can just add a little depth and interest and intrigue that makes it feel less inconsequential and not like you're trying to write yourself out of a corner. That it is something of tangible experience. I love making these sorts of videos because easily accessible education discussions are something I am really proud to be a part of, that I can provide. I think it is one of, if not the best things about the modern internet, even with all of the less good stuff. I like talking about storytelling and world building, but there is a whole other world of people who are learning to code and program and analyze data, which I can tell you, in a world where you're trying to make a living online, is an invaluable skill, professionally and creatively. I actually took a course about 2 years ago learning to code so that I could try and create a game for myself. It's always been a dream of mine to try and create like a game that I can write the story for and do the animations for and everything, put that all together, which is why it's awesome that Brilliant is giving everyone access to a whole range of classes covering all this kind of sorts of stuff. Whatever you want to learn, it's up to you, and you can learn a lot in a month, completely for free at my link down below, or 20% off an annual subscription if you want that. My job means that I actually deal with a lot of data. You don't necessarily see it, but there's a lot of data behind this screen, and it is sometimes very difficult to know if I'm doing okay, which numbers I should focus on, which numbers I should ignore, what trends I should be taking note of, where I should experiment. And Brilliant has courses where you can also learn how to interpret huge amounts of data. Really important if you're self-employed. Brilliant can teach you programming, giving you more control over what you want to create so you don't have to be reliant on other people and other programs. Or if you're just interested in learning more about the world scientifically, knowledge is cool for the sake of knowledge, I'm kind of that person, then it has a huge number of hands-on classes for that. Point is, it's better if you try it out for yourself. You know what you're going to enjoy, what you're going to find helpful and educational as you build your skills. I can help with English and writing and world building. Brilliant can do a lot more with maths and science and programming, because I'm still into. My link is down below, and it really would mean a lot if you clicked my link. It tells them that you came from me. That helps me, helps the channel. Sponsors are really helpful, and checking them out helps me out. But let's just resurrect everything that we've talked about in this video and into a summary. 1. Resurrection stories are often less about the resurrected character than those around them, their grief, what they're willing to do to avoid it, and the relationship we have with death. Alternatively, resurrection can be a beautiful expression of love or other positive things conquering death. 2. Resurrection often explores the place death has in the human condition. This is often reflected in the nature of the resurrection, the cost paid by the resurrectee or resurrector, how it changes the person coming back into the story to follow. However, consider whether death is important for us to remain human and any ethical ramifications you want to consider. 3. We do not tend to mind resurrection if there is a large cost associated with it, either to a character or the effort spent to the narrative, or if we believe in what it represents thematically. 4. Sometimes a character will come back worse, but they can also come back stronger, wiser, or even more divine. Death could be a purifying force, while resurrection is a renewal. 5. Resurrection can cheapen the stakes. Consider relying on alternate sources of tension or punishing characters in other ways. 6. Death often serves a place in the tapestry of your story. It gives weight and meaning to certain ideas around it. Does resurrecting your character undermine that? Does bringing them back ask more interesting questions than the meaning their original death provided? Often, the answer is no, especially if unplanned. Some resurrections work as commentaries on the original suffering and death of the character.